Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
It's the moment you have been waiting for. Dr. Robert A. Heineman, Alfred University professor, a political science emeritus. All right, Doc, we got a lot of topics here today. Let's start with Afghanistan.
Yes. Clearly it appears to be some movement there in terms of our withdrawing from Afghanistan. And I think one indication of the fact that there's some real movement there is Trump is saying very little about it as far as I can see. In his impromptu press conference, he was asked, and I think the most profound statement he made was that the Taliban and the Afghan government really don't like each other very much, which I thought was pretty profound. I'm joking there. But no, it's pretty clear we're getting ready to pull out. And I think the one thing we want out of that, at the very minimum, and fundamentally, is that the Taliban agrees not to finance or support terrorist camps or recruitment that would be used against us. Because that's where this all started as far as we're concerned, is they're using, providing bases for Al-Qaeda to train and attack the United States. And in any case, as Trump points out, we've been in there 17, 18 years at least, and, it's really time that the Afghan government and Afghan forces begin to defend themselves. Now, whether they can or not, I have no idea. But it is true that if we pull out, I think some people are going to get hurt. There's no two ways about that.
You're talking about the people that live there.
Yes, and especially women, because the Taliban has very rigorous and severe kind of standards for what women can and can't do, whereas under the current government, women have been attending schools, getting an education, and getting involved. Taliban not for that. So it depends on how much power the Taliban will have after we pull out. But, they're a pretty decisive force. So people are going to get hurt. But on the other hand, how long can we stay there? And the fact is, been there 18 years, and the Afghan forces, why would they still need our support? I mean, we've been training them, we've been providing them with material. There's no reason why they can't defend themselves. But I think I think it's time to get out of there and stay out of there. We can always, of course, use drones and remote weapons of one sort or another to punish the Taliban if they're not living up to their end of the bargain. So let's hope Trump's successful there.
You mentioned in your answer there, Dr. Heineman, the phrase impromptu pressers by President Trump. What do you make of those?
Impromptu press conference?
Yes.
I certainly would not recommend that for Mr. Trump. I think any president who engages in that kind of activity is asking for misrepresentations, is asking for situations where he says things that he wishes he hadn't said. And Trump's impromptu press conference, which I, in fact, listened to some of, he just makes statements that are easily twisted out of context, and they come back to bite him. There's one about being the chosen one, which are words that, you really shouldn't be using, I think. It's going to be used out of context. But all he was saying was that somebody had to stand up to China, and he's the guy that's been picked to do it. Now maybe that he picked himself, I'm not sure. But clearly that's all he meant, and clearly it's true. So that easily taken out of context. Then, of course, you had his discussion of the Democratic Party and the relationship with the Jewish state, with Israel. And, his point was, why are Jewish Democrats continuing to represent or continuing to support the Democrats when you got people like AOC and a number of other anti-Israeli people in the party? Why would they be supporting Democrats? Why would they be voting Democrat? And, of course, he's right. Quite a number of these progressive Democrats are sympathetic to the Palestinians and are really quite critical about the way Israel has interacted with the Palestinians. Obviously, Trump isn't on that side of the fence. And, again, all he was saying is, why are these guys voting Democrat? But it's being used, again, pretty much. In fact, they're trying to twist it to make it appear that somehow Donald Trump is anti-Semitic. Come on. So at any rate, it leads to all kinds of problems. Now, one aspect of these Trump statements and such is, you're never quite sure where he's coming from and what he's going to say. And I think in one sense that has to make the Iranians, the North Koreans, the Russians, and the Chinese, it's got to make them a little nervous when they're dealing with him, because you're just never quite sure where the guy's coming from. I suppose to a certain extent that's a bit of an advantage. I'm not sure.
How about the whole let me buy Greenland, no you can't, we won't let you deal?
Yes, well, Trump just views it, I guess, as another real estate transaction there. I must say, I think the whole thing is hilarious. I couldn't stop laughing the other night when I was listening to BBC going on about interviewing the Prime Minister of Denmark and going on about Trump's comments. It's just kind of hilarious that the whole idea of international relations in the world today has come down to the fact that Denmark doesn't want to let Trump buy Greenland. I mean, where are we going with this? I mean, it just talk about comic relief in international politics. It's really pretty bizarre. Now, I think though that Denmark may be missing a chance here, because I think they could get quite a bit better price for Greenland than the Russians got for Alaska. When we bought Alaska from them, I think we paid a mere pittance. But on the other hand, I don't think the people in Greenland are interested, and clearly the people in Denmark are. The whole thing is pretty bizarre.
Talking to Dr. Bob here on this Friday in late August. Dr. Bob, the Squad. Been a lot of talk about them lately.
The Squad? Could you identify them for me, Brian?
Well, earlier this week, Omar and Talib were written up in an article in the Jerusalem Post that said that the two hinted that they wanted to cut funding to Israel.
Yeah, well, I think they probably do. Again, they're not friends of Israel, and they're critical of Israel, and they're supportive of the Palestinians. I expect that they're not interested in providing more funds for Israel. They're not the only ones, I suppose, but they're clearly the more outspoken among the Democrats.
Had Congressman Tom Reed on earlier this week, and we talked about that, and he spoke, I don't want to say harshly, but very critically of the two.
No. our congressman is critical
of the squad
the lady,
and Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Trump's poll numbers seem to be dropping. Do you trust the polls?
Well, it depends, again, who's doing the polling and what kind of questions are being asked. But the numbers I saw recently showed him with something like a 60% unfavorable rating. And that's that's a serious problem. I think a couple of things about that kind of showing in the polls. Number one, it's a lot more difficult to raise money when you're running in that kind of negative level, although the Republicans aren't having any trouble right now raising money. They're doing pretty well. But more broadly, if you're in China or some of these other countries, you're sitting there looking at these poll numbers, and Xi Jinping may well be thinking, well, why should I give much to the Americans in negotiation right now? It's probable Trump will be defeated. We just hang on for another year and a half or so, and he'll go away. And so that's one of the problems with that kind of negative rating. Let's say Trump was up with 60% favorability ratings in the polls. And you're in China trying to negotiate, you may well think, well, we better get something going here because we're going to put up with this guy for some time. So that's one of the real problems of that situation. Yeah.
But do you trust the polls? I mean,
I don't know, Brian. It depends on the poll.
Depends on the poll. Depends on the timing of the poll and when it came out.
Right.
You think closer to the election they're more accurate?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Dr. Bob, let's get to the Democrat candidates. There's been a lot of talk about Joe Biden lately. I think the New York Times put out an article saying that he's got an enthusiasm problem.
You mean an enthusiasm problem from his perspective or from what supporters he has?
New York Times reported Thursday the Democrat frontrunner Joe Biden leads in the polls, but suffers from an enthusiasm gap among supporters that makes him vulnerable to his many challengers.
Yes, I would say that's probably one of the news releases from the New York Times that's reasonably accurate. Yeah, I think there's a real problem there. And I might note the other day, one of the news articles was discussing the possibility of Governor Cuomo becoming Biden's chief of staff. Now, my view would be there's no way that Andrew Cuomo is interested in being a chief of staff to President Biden. But the real advantage of bringing up those kinds of stories is that it begins to bring Cuomo's name to the fore here and begins to moving forward as a kind of as an important Democrat and perhaps someone who might end up in the White House. And as you know, our position has been all along that Cuomo will come into the race here as it moves along.
You know who's been making news here and there is that Anthony Scaramouche.
Yes.
Also known as the Mooch. That's his nickname. And now he seems to be veering to the left and popping up here and there, making a lot of criticisms of President Trump, saying that Trump is not sane, Trump is not fit, blah, blah, blah. Vanity Fair just reported that Scaramouche went to Bill Clinton's birthday party last weekend.
Oh, my.
How relevant are all these never-Trumpers? Some of them used to be close to Trump, but how relevant are these types?
Well, a continuing drumbeat there. I'm not certain that they play all that well out in the rest of the country. What you're dealing with here are a lot of people that Trump knew when he was working on real estate deals and putting together his gambling enterprises and things like that. I mean, so these are all mostly East Coasters who have that sort of elitist bent to them, and so things don't go their way. They tend to get pretty unpleasant. But for people out in the rest of the country, I don't know whether they care much what Scaramouche says one way or another. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the way it is. There's a lot of people that put out. Rob Reiner's put out statements. Michael Moore's, but now they're a little bit more relevant than Scaramouche. But
yeah. So it's it is kind of interesting though that Trump, in many ways, is, I think, a pretty hard fellow to work for. And, he's you're going to do things his way, and if he's not satisfied with the level at which you're doing it, you're going to be going either way.
Speaking of the Trumps, I was reading on Breitbart that Jared and Ivanka have been keeping out of the spotlight since Trump's statements the other day about Jewish voters in Israel.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And, what do they got to add anyway? I mean, they're certainly not going to. I mean, the problem with the statement that Trump was making about the Democratic Jewish voters, the problem with that is Americans don't like anybody tell them how they should be voting in the way that Trump was conveying it. And so whether it's Italian Americans and worried about, what was it, Frito, or...
wasn't that more of a conversation that you'd be having with aides privately about demographic groups?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, that's...
You wouldn't say that. You might say privately, how come I'm not doing well with this group?
Right, that's the problem with these impromptu press conferences. Trump just blows it off the top of his head. And this is... listen to him in that press conference. You're thinking, well, this is a sort of situation, the kind of group situations you run into with Trump. He just lets it fly. And it doesn't make too much sense to be doing that with the press. But no, you're right. Those are the sorts of things people are going to be talking about among themselves and in their staff meetings and such in the White House.
How about this demographic, this group, this ethnic group? I don't get the votes from them. Why is that? Blah, blah, blah.
Right.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with Dr. Bob right after this.
At Larry's Latrines, they know the last thing on your mind is what's brewing in your septic tank. You're thinking about hot dogs and hanging with friends, but Larry's Latrines is thinking about what's brewing in your septic tank. Inching closer and closer to the surface. Don't wait. Schedule your septic maintenance today. Larry's Latrines works diligently from now until the ground freezes to make sure everyone is safe from overflow. Larry's Latrines in Hornell. It's their business to handle your business.
Talking to Dr. Robert A. Heineman today on the Newsmaker Show. Dr. Bob, in the break you said something about the California school system. What were you talking about?
Well, apparently now in California, they're looking to make social activism part of the curriculum from K through 12. In other words, students should be taught how to become social activists and engage in activist activities to remedy the tremendous social and political faults that America has. Now, I don't know we have all those faults, but they still keep coming across the Rio Grande and wanting to live here. So what you're doing is, I guess, teaching these kids to become dissidents of one sort or another, take to the streets. I'm not sure. But I think to begin teaching this sort of thing to high school students whose hormones are running wild anyway, I just think that's... I wish they would just teach them to read and write. I would be satisfied with that. But no.
On the topic of education, I was talking to a friend of mine from college. He lives in Ohio. And he said he was reading up on New York State politics as far as education goes, and he was surprised that Governor Cuomo was a charter school supporter.
Yeah, I think that's true. But again, I'm not all that familiar with. But Yeah, he's come under some heat from the education unions in the state in that respect, yeah.
The Education Union for New York State, NYSA, put out a statement early Thursday afternoon. What they said was the testing, that mandatory testing for grades 3 through 8 are not, in their words, valid and need to be repaired, and somebody needs to get on the job pronto.
Yeah, well, I don't know what they're dealing with there. I will say this, though. I mean, we can criticize New York, and I think we should if we've got problems with some of the efforts they're undertaking. But you compare the New York State educational system to a lot of the others, and it's not too bad. Now, some of these states, I think it's Iowa and Utah and some of those states, I mean, their educational systems are really way up there. But given the whole variety of people and interests that they have to deal with, I think our teachers are doing a pretty good job out there. And I support charter schools, too, pretty strongly. But across the board,
I don't know what the charter schools are like as far as Common Core goes and the mandatory testing, but you talk to any teacher, they'll tell you that these kids today are over-tested.
Oh, that's probably true. And that's, again, you've got a state system that tends to be highly centralized and bureaucratized. And one of their ways of trying to keep control and pushing their particular points of view is to run through these so-called standards that students have to meet, and it does take away from the basic kind of broad liberal arts approach you'd like to see a little bit more of in our schools. But again, these kids come out here and out of the New York State system. Now again, some of these inner city schools are really, really pretty rough, but generally speaking, I think the New York system does a pretty fair job of educating kids.
Final quick question. If Cuomo ever gets drafted or in a situation where he's running for president because he wants to or because someone else wants him to, how would he position himself? As the guy that fought the left in New York State or the guy that pushed the left in New York State? Because he's kind of reinvented himself a couple times.
Right. Yeah, no, I think reinventing is a good point there. I think he's in a position, and I think he's careful to stay in a position, I think, where he's not too far to the left by any means. And so he can try to show a more conservative, moderate view, and I think he can pull that off in some respects. Of course, he's got a lot of corruption issues there to play with, and then you've got all the data in terms of population loss and a lot of the problems with the economy in New York State, a lot of which are the result of the state interfering with private enterprise and the requirements there, and the tax structure, which of course is the heaviest in the country or second heaviest. So those are things he's got to deal with. But given the gung-ho liberal nutso elements in the Democrat Party across the board, he looks pretty good from a more moderate point of view. And so I think, and I will say this:
Democrats going for him.
Yeah, and I will say this for Cuomo: when when we have an emergency, when we have a crisis of one sort or another, he really has shown himself again and again capable of stepping forward and seeing that action is taken.
He's not golfing in Hawaii when those things
happen.
No,
he's you may not agree with it, what he's done exactly, but he certainly does take action. So I think he'd have a pretty good shot.
All right, Doc, with that, we got to go. I want to thank you so much for stopping by.
Well, I'm glad you shut me off when you did, because the next thing you know, I'd be pushing Democratic candidates.